I'll tell you what Bob McNamara said. He said, Haig's the only Army officer I know who tells me what he thinks, and I was then a lieutenant colonel. What happens is you get men that don't advance in the military structure unless they are what I call responsive to the political leadership. And when you get that kind of a guy, you're teaching the wrong values to our military officers. And that's why I like to see our young military officers go to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and get the kind of education that drive them into some broader considerations as they go up the line where they're going to have heavier responsibility.
Southwest States Teachers College, too.
But
not bad.
One of the problems with the analysis was that they made a cost-benefit analysis, and they thought they could make the North Vietnamese pay more at every step than they could gain. And that is sort of a statistical way of looking at things. But these people were revolutionaries. They had fought all their lives. And very early, I was not at the beginning, I was mostly focused on Europe, but very early there was an interview that Pham Van Dong had with Harrison Salisbury. Pham Van Dong was the prime minister of North Vietnam. And he said, we're going to win because there are more North Vietnamese willing to die for South Vietnam than there are Americans. And therefore, once you were engaged in that war, if you did not bring it to a military conclusion, if you fought it as a war of attrition, in which you were trying to calculate precisely to do not a thing more than was being done to you, you were bound to lose.
Ted Sorensen, you wanted in on this, I believe.
Well, if we're going to get into a contest of our old memos here, I could get out mine in which I said to President Kennedy very, very early, if there was ever a country that had to save itself, Vietnam is that country. There's also one, Jack, to President Johnson during the 3 months that I stayed on and served President Johnson, in which I said to him that before any commitment is made, the Vietnamese government must agree to implement all of the reforms that we had insisted upon for them to get the support of the Vietnamese population in the countryside. Tax reforms, land reforms, administrative reforms, political reforms, and so forth. So anyway, you were about to ask me a question.
I was about to ask you about President Kennedy's feelings following the assassination of Diem.
President Kennedy was shocked by the assassination of Diem. He was not a great fan of Diem because by that time, Diem, whom he had 10 years earlier had some hopes for as a Democrat who could obtain true independence and self-determination for South Vietnam. By that time, Diem had come under the control of his corrupt brother, the brother's wife, and some of the landlords in that country, and Diem was refusing to accept any one of those reforms that I just listed a minute ago, which I had repeated in my memo to President Johnson because he was new on the job. But he didn't want Diem killed, and there had been a long debate inside the government over the text of a letter going out to our ambassador in Saigon, who every month would say, oh, there's a new coup attempt, as Jack presented a little more frankly. The new coup attempt being reported, and the question is, would the United States shine a green light or a red light on coup attempts? And Kennedy, it's true, was getting fed up with that government, but he did not want a coup attempt that was going to assassinate President Diem.
So because there is that memorandum to file that exists on tape and all the analysis of it, and because we're here and this would be a good time to lay it on the record like a good prosecuting attorney, President Kennedy had nothing to do with the assassination of President Diem.
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Secretary Kissinger, several questions. This is going to shock you on the Christmas bombing. What was the justification for bombing Cambodia that eventually led to the rise of Khmer Rouge and the atrocities committed? And let me link that with this. Can you explain the reasoning in widening the air war into Cambodia and Laos without telling Congress or the American public?
First of all, the premise of that question is totally wrong, but I'll be glad to tell you what happened. The premise of the question that the bombing of a 5-mile strip along the Cambodian border led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, and that the Khmer Rouge then that murdered 2 million people, all because of American actions, is an example of a kind of masochism that is really in many ways inexcusable. Let me describe exactly what happened. There had been a bombing halt negotiated at the end of the Johnson administration. Negotiations were supposed to start and were just starting. President Nixon came in at the end of January 1969. Within 4 weeks after he came in, on February 22nd, a North Vietnamese attack started in which 500 Americans a week were being killed. After we had agreed to a bombing halt and had observed the bombing halt, President Nixon waited for 4 weeks till we had 2,000 dead. That is more than we've had in all the years in Iraq. And then he did not want to end the bombing halt, and he decided to concentrate on the 4 North Vietnamese divisions that were located in sanctuaries within 8 or within 10 kilometers, however you translate that into miles, 5+ miles along the border, came into South Vietnam, killed Americans, then went back into the sanctuaries. In January 1968, Sihanouk, the ruler of Cambodia, had told Chester Bowles that he did not know what was going on in these regions, that the North Vietnamese had expelled all the Cambodians, and that the United States was in effect free to do what it wanted in those regions. So it was in this context that President Nixon ordered an attack on the sanctuaries. The original plan was that we would make the attack, we would wait for somebody to protest, we would then ask for a UN investigation of the claim, they would find sanctuaries, and we would then go on from there. To our amazement, nobody protested. Nobody said anything. Not Sihanouk, not the North Vietnamese. And so then, gradually, at first slowly, and then fairly regularly, the bombing continued. The argument that Cambodians were driven out of these sanctuaries into Cambodia is an absolute untruth. There were practically no Cambodians living there. Nobody has ever seen any casualties. Later on, when the war spread deeper into Cambodia, when the North Vietnamese tried to take the rest of the country, that was no longer the case, and there were Cambodian casualties. But one of the myths that has to be cleaned up. It's that why should the United States respect sanctuaries from which Americans are being killed along the Vietnamese border, where the head of the government had said that he did not, in fact, that he would welcome some American action, and said it again, which is never reported. He said it at a press conference. He said, if a Cambodian, I hear about these attacks, if a buffalo is killed, you'll hear from me. But since there are no Cambodians living there, and since I have no report of casualties, I don't recognize that there are attacks going on there. These are the facts of that bombing. And
incidentally, the Congress was
and that's right.
fully informed, because I know we did it. And we had the leaders of the House and the Senate there.
25 leaders of the House and Congress were fully informed of this. And this is one of the myths to which an end should be put.
Secretary Haig, does the U.S. bear any moral or other responsibility for the unintended consequences of our use of defoliants like Agent Orange in Vietnam?
Of course. Anything that's done, it wasn't done intentionally. Nobody did that intentionally. They were trying to save lives and to defoliate areas where infiltrators were moving without opposition to kill innocent civilian women and children in South Vietnam. And they did it wholesale. But the consequences were very, very bad.
Jack Valenti, a question came up to this degree, and it's not meant to sound a flip as it may come off. The air war in Gulf War I really took place as they, quote, softened the ground prior to General Schwarzkopf's ground invasion without any press coverage at all. The Pentagon, in effect, said, no, look away. How would such a policy, if you could have brought down the window shade on news media coverage of military operations on the ground in Vietnam, the subject of a later panel today, how would such a policy have changed the outcome, in your view, of the war that eventually took down your boss?
Well, the fact is that there was no censorship in Vietnam. I suppose it's the only war that we fought without censorship. I talked to David Halberstam about this. He said sometimes it was hard to get on helicopters, but literally correspondents could go wherever they chose to go. As he pointed out, if you couldn't get a helicopter, you got a taxi cab to go. The point is that this was the only war fought without censorship. I'm a great believer in having the press cover every war. I think it's important for the people to understand what's going on. Now, the fact is that every night in living color during that Vietnam War, the body bags came back in avalanching numbers. And I have no doubt it had an enormous effect on the American public of what the heck are we doing there with all of these casualties. But without the press, you are ignorant. And I'm a great believer. First, I'm a fierce advocate of the First Amendment. And I think that those 45 words are the one clause in the Constitution which guarantees all the others. We wouldn't have a democratic republic without the First Amendment. So I'm a great advocate of the war. Of correspondence covering a war. It does have, let's face it, it does have an effect that those in power find unsuitable, because it does change public opinion. But that's a fact of life. But I see no reason why the press shouldn't be covering every war.
Dr. Kissinger, your name keeps coming up in these questions. When you uttered the iconic statement, "We believe peace is at hand," did you have a political motivation?
First of all, I urge all of you to read that press conference. What had happened, and since there are about 40,000 phone conversations of mine, and endless conversations with President Nixon on many subjects, you will find that politics was not a subject that I ever discussed. We had gone through a year of great agony and of many decisions. We had faced an all-out North Vietnamese offensive very similar to what the Johnson administration faced in '68, and we had brought the negotiations almost to the point of success, and then it proved too difficult to complete them. And the first thing, and then the North Vietnamese published the text of the negotiations as they then stood. If you read the press conference, the way this question is put, and the way it is often presented is, I came out from behind the curtain, I said, peace is at hand, ducked behind the curtain, and had a great headline, and of allegedly great benefit to President Nixon. If you read the discussions between President Nixon and me during that whole period, he didn't particularly want an agreement. He said he had all the voters except the ones that were fanatically devoted to McGovern, and he couldn't get any. He couldn't get any of those. So he really would have preferred if the negotiations had been more protracted. I pushed them, and he agreed, because we thought we had found the North Vietnamese in having made the first error of analysis. They thought our position would be stronger after the election. We knew that the Congress would probably vote us out of the war after the election, and we knew also that the Pentagon, because of its budgetary constraints, had already planned to reduce our forces in B-52s and other aircraft after the election by a third. So we wanted to use the fact that the North Vietnamese thought, but if you read my press conference, it was an hour's press conference that went point by point through everything that had been negotiated and that laid out exactly where we stood. My major concern was to keep the parties whose distrust of each other was legendary, to keep the process going so that we could pick up right after the election where we had stood, rather than to have the whole thing blown up. All the people that were negotiating with me, we had spent 4 years of negotiating. We had committed ourselves to this, and to us, the outcome of the election that was already preordained at that point played absolutely no role in the discussion. And I would just urge you all, don't just read that sentence, read the 4 typewritten single-space copies of the whole text and see whether there was anything in there that was even remotely misleading.
Ted Sorensen, I understand a tape was played during the section yesterday, and we hope to try to merge audio and video and perhaps play it during today's session. Chilling in its use of words like insurgency. This was the Oval Office conversation, the President, Maxwell Taylor, McNamara. It was about a drawdown, of all things. It was about the American withdrawal of Vietnam by a date certain, and of all things, a notion to train the local Vietnamese to take over their own conflict. The comparisons are clear. I think it's clear to everyone in the audience where comparisons between Vietnam and Iraq fall flat on their face. Which ones do you see as applicable?
First, what's the date? About October 1st?
What was the date on the conversation? October 2nd.
Okay.
Which comparisons do you find applicable? So much conversation today about the war in Iraq.
I think there are some comparisons, although, as Lieutenant Colonel Haig's memo to Joe Califano pointed out, we were only getting into the war in Vietnam. His memo, I think he said it was dated 1965, and President Kennedy was killed in 1963. So my first-hand knowledge is limited. But I think that in Vietnam we were facing then, and in Iraq we are facing now, a people determined to throw out foreign troops, and it's almost impossible to defeat those insurgents. I think that we are facing in Iraq now a bitterly divided cultural, whatever you want to call it, sectarian, ethnic, or otherwise situation, as we were in Vietnam then. I'm told that there are some back-channel negotiations going on now between some of our military in Iraq and some of the insurgent leaders. I have said earlier that during President Kennedy's time, had there been leaders of the Viet Cong who could have negotiated on behalf of anyone, whether it was the North Vietnamese or even the Viet Cong rank and file, I think that Kennedy and Bundy would have found a way to open negotiations with them. But in those days, there were no negotiations possible. I think he, as I said in an op-ed piece not so long ago, Kennedy said, if they ever ask us to leave, we'll be on the boats the next day. And it's not that difficult to arrange for the Iraqi government that we put in power to ask us to leave. I hope they'll do that soon.
And General Haig, a question for you, which may have been asked and answered, but maybe you want to take a second whack at this in this context. Do you believe that the Vietnam War could have been won by the United States?
Of course. There's no doubt about it. And I saw it firsthand in the Christmas bombing. And I discussed it with poor President Nixon before he died, and he described the greatest mistake of his presidency was his failure to end the war decisively by bringing the facts of the war to the Soviet Union in nothing but straight threatening ways, and to apply the power that we had at our disposal, which in a matter of several weeks brought Hanoi to its knees at the Christmas bombing. And our prisoners were released, and they were back in Paris making concessions that they had heretofore never even expressed a willingness, although they went from a base developed before those bombings, which were the framework. And so what really happened was that the president was threatened with impeachment if he continued the bombing. Everyone in his cabinet abandoned him and told him he had to cease the bombing. If he had gone on with it for another 3 to 4 months, it's my view a victory would have been to have the North withdraw back to the Geneva Accords agreements, the 38th parallel, and I think they would have. But he simply could not do it because of the political situation.
Dr. Kissinger, I didn't mean to interrupt the applause. Dr. Kissinger, from your old friend in the audience, Ambassador Bill Vanden Heuvel, there is this. In a memorandum to Gerald Ford, where the president asked you what lessons there were to be learned from Vietnam, you wrote, quote, "There are really not that many lessons." In the light of the Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq, do you see any lessons of the war in Vietnam that might be relevant for us?
I don't have that memorandum clearly in mind, and it may have been applied to the situation of 75. Are there lessons to be learned from Vietnam? Yes, there are a number of lessons to be learned, and a few of them I already mentioned. There's been a lot of talk here about reform, and it is absolutely true that it would be highly desirable to be involved in situations where the government and the people are in harmony with each other. Those, however, are the least likely situations to arise. And then to the problem we faced in Vietnam, which we are facing today in Iraq, is how much reform can you do simultaneously with fighting a war? And that is a question which we have found extremely difficult to solve. In Vietnam, we had one advantage vis-a-vis compared to Iraq, that we had a fairly homogeneous population. And towards the end of the Vietnam War, there was a government that was substantially in control of its region. In Iraq, we are facing a society that is split into sectarian and ethnic groups, and in which therefore there's not an adequate sense of nationhood, and where even a government, when it is formed, will more likely see its ministers represent sectarian divisions and sectarian interests than the national interests. And the question that we need to address is not whether we should be committed to democracy. Of course we should be committed to democracy. But the pace at which it can be achieved and the relationship, especially in situations like Iraq and Vietnam, to the immediate security situations. I know the problem better than the answer, but it's one of the challenges we absolutely face.
Jack, in the war, as we mentioned, in the war of guns versus butter, where the Johnson administration is concerned, guns won. And this question asks you comment on your boss's ability to admit or acknowledge errors.
Well, I don't know of any president who goes on television and said, folks, I screwed up. I just don't think they do that. Johnson. Well, that's true.
Bay of Pigs, Iran-Contra.
I stand corrected. That is true. And his ratings went sky high after that. Johnson was honeycombed with contradictions. I have said publicly, as I've said privately, that almost anything you can say about Lyndon Johnson, good or bad, had a tinge of truth in it. What he was committed to, with a passion that was undiluted and persistent, was trying to reach out to those pressed against the wall because of circumstances over which they had no control, to reach out to the undereducated young and the poor and the old and the sick and the black. And I remember that Ralph Ellison, 2 days before Johnson left office in a big dinner in New York, came up to him, and I was standing there, and he said, "Mr. President, because of Vietnam, you're just going to have to suffer from being the greatest American president we've ever had for the poor and the old and the sick and the black." But he said, that's not a bad epitaph. I think, in retrospect, in his retirement at his ranch, and by the way, what you saw is a man in retirement who literally, I think, was welcoming death. Johnson died 4 years after he left office. His age, 64. So the war had a terrifying influence on him. I never heard him actually say in private, I made a big mistake there. But there was implied that perhaps he should have done things differently. He was caught in this this, I guess you might say, contradictory area of fight the war without raising taxes. I think one of his mistakes was we should have raised taxes. You can't fight a war unless you have the funds to do it. But at the same time, he wanted to build his great society. And you were at the beginning of that, Ted. And all of us were there. And that was very expensive. And the war on poverty and Head Start and Medicare and Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Civil Rights Act of 64, all very expensive. That, I think, was a big mistake. We should have raised taxes and tried to fight the war in Vietnam and build the great society at the same time. But in the end, it just was not possible.
There's a story told that your old boss lit up a cigarette on what was formerly Air Force One, carrying him back to Texas. And when asked about it by Mrs. Johnson, he said, "My last couple of years belonged to the country. These next couple belong to me."
Well, that's true. He started smoking cigarettes. His weight ballooned. When he was president, he used to drink Fresca, which completely dismayed people who came in to see him. When he asked, "What do you want to drink?" and they had to drink Fresca. To Everett Dirksen, that was an abysmal sin. But he took care of Johnson used to say, and I think this is important, he said, for a president, it's not enough to do good, you've got to look good. Not only physically, but you've got to look good in the eyes of the people. If you ask me what his greatest mistake, and I must say I tried desperately to get him to do this, I wanted the president during that Vietnam War to go on television and make a series of no more than 10-minute talks, making it clear to everybody on television that their favorite sitcom would just be delayed 10 minutes, but it would continue on. They'd get the whole sitcom. Nothing more terrifying to the public than hearing a president and losing all in the family or whatever they were watching. And I said, why are we in Vietnam would be the thing. What are we doing to reconstruct Vietnam? How are we doing militarily? I tried to say to the president that FDR and Churchill were very transparent with the American people. They told it, as he would say, with the bark off, even when there was bad news to give. For reasons which I cannot fathom. He never said no to me, but he never said yes, and he never did it. I happen to believe that was a grand omission, that I think he would have had a lot better rapport with the American people if he had talked to them over and again. Now, he wasn't the great orator, the debonair, witty fellow that came over as the first television president, John Kennedy. But he did have a kind of energy and force about him that I think would have been useful.
Ted Sorensen, why didn't the Kennedy-Johnson administrations learn more from the lessons of the French?
I can't speak for the Johnson administration. Kennedy actually had studied the lessons of the French and had, as I mentioned, spoken about it first as a member of the House, twice as a member of the Senate, that we did not want to repeat it. That doesn't mean he didn't make errors of omission. Perhaps when I say Vietnam never rose to a high level of study, such as XCOM in the Kennedy administration, perhaps it should have. Perhaps it was getting worse, and he was putting off decisions as to whether to go in all the way. But there were no errors of commission because he did not go in all the way.
Secretary Haig, did Vietnam create the crises of the late 1960s, or did the crises of the 1960s create Vietnam?
Now, that's a very thoughtful question.
That's why I asked it.
I meant to compliment you.
It's somebody else's.
I think there's no question that Vietnam had a tremendous impact on the American society and all that's followed since. Some blame it on the press. I've always said it wasn't bad press that lost Vietnam, it was bad policy. The only contention I would have about the press was that they didn't know why it was bad policy. And they very seldom got around to describing why it was bad policy. But they were right in their criticisms. Now, having said that, there hasn't been a thing happened in our capital since. And it merged, of course, with Watergate. And the two events, Vietnam and Watergate, are what have made the major impact on post-Vietnam America. There's a fractionalization among the parties today that exceed anything I ever saw in the vitriolic lack of cooperation between the two parties. And we simply have to correct this. And we also have to, again, reinstill our young people with the desirability of public service. We don't have the same caliber of legislators we had when I entered government. Men who thought first of the country and second of the party and its interests. Today it's been reversed, and it's one man, one vote. There's no discipline with any committee on the Hill. There's no way a president could bring in a few leaders and make a consensus decision that they'll support. Because the more outrageous you are on the Hill, the more attention you get from the press.
Secretary Kissinger, a signed question from Professor Jeffrey Kimball, Miami University of Ohio. During October 1969, President Nixon asked the Pentagon to prepare a secret program of strategic military readiness measures, which included nuclear-armed B-52s, readiness measures that Soviet authorities would notice, but not notice to the point of alarming them. To what extent do you believe such military measures would encourage Moscow to be more helpful in acting as an intermediary with Hanoi? Professor, you owe me one.
First of all, I do not believe that President Nixon ever ordered any specific set of measures, such as you have mentioned. What the context, what some historians are now doing is they pick a document or a sentence, and then they ask you a question about this without explaining the context. The context had been that there had been negotiations in Paris for 6 months without the slightest progress. That I had a secret meeting in Paris where we told the North Vietnamese that we were eager to make progress, but that if there were not progress, other steps might be taken. President Nixon had also said this publicly, and he had said this to the Soviets. He ordered not any specific set of measures, but he ordered a study of what measures were available. We worked on these, and finally President Nixon decided that he would not implement any of those measures, and that he would continue more or less with the strategy that was being pursued at the time, which was Vietnamization and simultaneous negotiation. So you're talking here of a study paper that was never implemented, never submitted to the National Security Council, in which President Nixon decided not to carry out. Is this an accurate description from memory?
I think it's pretty good. I wouldn't have been that buttoned down on answering that question, but I don't recall it ever happening. We did have alerts in the Nixon presidency, and that was during the Yom Kippur War, when we were confronting a unilateral Soviet intervention in the Sinai.
But you're talking about a Vietnam plan.
Yeah.
I don't recall any ever implemented. We had some additional measures of readiness taken.
This question refers to an NSC paper that never went anywhere.
Well, you can take that up with the professor. A question for Messrs. Sorensen and Haig. Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon all continued and deepened our involvement in Vietnam, at least in part to honor our, quote, commitment. What harm, if any, came to our role in the world as a country or our leadership from our defeat there in 1975? Mr. Sorensen, you first.
Not much, frankly. I think it affected morale inside the United States, It made successive administrations fearful of getting involved, which on balance was probably a good thing, but it may have at times contributed to isolationism and therefore unilateralism, which is rampant in Washington today, and that, I think, is a bad thing.
Secretary Haig, same question.
Well, I don't know that I would answer that question any differently than it's just been answered, quite frankly.
Jack Valenti, a question tying again Iraq and Vietnam. Do you believe, how can we get out of Iraq if you believe no war can succeed without public support and we cannot win when there is an insurgency?
Well, I'm not smart enough to figure out how we get out of Iraq any more than I was smart enough to figure out how to get out of Vietnam. So the answer is I don't know. And I'm not one of those who came out of the Johnson administration saying I was a dove and I was against the war. I was not, because I was against the war, but I didn't have a suitable alternative to what the president was doing. His strategy was to try to bring the North Vietnamese to the table so that they could negotiate. Johnson was fond of quoting from Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together." He told me many times privately, he said, if I could just get in a room with Ho Chi Minh, we could work out something and let us get out of this war with some honor and let's stop this fighting. So I don't have an answer. And I don't know that anybody has one.
Secretary Kissinger, this may require reflection on your part. What did your role, your involvement in the Vietnam War, looking back, do to alter your life? You have been the subject of so many works and books and treatises and screeds on that subject. How is your life different today that you were involved in a policymaking role in that conflict?
Well, he's famous, that's one thing.
Well, I got involved in Vietnam issues really sort of accidentally. I worked as a consultant in the Kennedy administration, but not on any of these issues for a while. And I slipped into a negotiation almost by accident. I was in the Johnson administration. I was at a scientific conference, a conference of scientists, where there were two scientists, and in the house of one of them, Ho Chi Minh had stayed during the negotiations, and he said he would be willing to go to Vietnam and offer assurances of peace and talk to Ho Chi Minh. And I notified Secretary Rusk and Secretary McNamara of this, and they asked me to act as a liaison. So I slid into the Vietnam issues. Then Ambassador Lodge invited me to come to Vietnam. And then President Nixon, whom I had opposed in 3 presidential campaigns, made me his security advisor. So it was not my destiny to be involved in Vietnam. It now has fundamentally, it has affected my life in the sense that the Nixon debate doesn't seem ever to end, and that for many I've become the surviving symbol of the Nixon administration and of the Vietnam period. So there is a great ingenuity being shown to go through masses of documents to find one sentence and separate it from context, and that can go on forever given the mass of material. To me, Vietnam, I came here as a refugee. I had lived in a dictatorship. For me, America was a very important experience. I did not like to, and I thought it was very important that America maintained its position in the world, and so I attempted to bring about the best settlement of which we were capable. I thought we could not afford to collapse and to withdraw unilaterally. During the Cambodian incursions, I had some staff members who wanted to resign in protest, and I told them, if you stay with me, we'll bring about peace in our way. And we thought we did. But this is not necessarily the perception of others. I normally do not participate in these debates. I agree to come here because the Kennedy family and the Kennedy entourage were important to me at a stage in my life and remained friends throughout this whole period with all the divisions. I had great sympathy for what they went through. I didn't agree on some points later on, and I worked with President Nixon, who I think served the country in foreign policy with enormous distinction and contributed greatly to ending the Vietnam War and creating the structure of the world which it now exists. And I have no regrets, and I had an opportunity to serve the country, which is all anyone can ask for.
I'd like to add one personal word to that, because I know Henry has been vilified by many people with whom I have associated over the years. I became an opponent of the Vietnam War when it escalated. And in 1970, the Lawyers' Committee Against the War in New York decreed there would be a march on Washington to protest and lobby and so on. And I said, to the surprise of some, that I would go see Henry Kissinger himself, the National Security Advisor in the White House at the time. And Henry graciously gave me an appointment, despite the fact that I was on the Nixon enemies list and was outspoken against the war. The fact that he was willing to reach out and hear me at that time, I think, is a testament to the goodwill he has borne toward those associated with Kennedys over the years.
Mr. Valenti.
I'd like to second what Ted said, that I'm a great admirer of Henry Kissinger. I think he always did what he thought was right, even though a lot of people didn't agree with him. But that's the plight of every public servant, and I think he's a great man. My valedictory is about war itself, because I don't know how many in the audience share my experiences. I know that on this panel, General Haig and I fought in wars. World War II is supposed to be the good war, but it wasn't. All wars are inhumane, brutal, callous, and full of depravity. And you learn as a young warrior to kill or be killed. It is not a suitable way to live a life. And I remember that when I finished 51 missions, I was now sent home when the war was over in Europe, and then dispatched. I was going to be dispatched for the invasion of Japan, flying a B-25 at 100 feet above the water. And I must tell you, whenever I hear people, a lot of historians, who prattle on about what an awful thing it was for President Truman to drop those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I'm always reminded that they were not in uniform at the time, or didn't have anybody in uniform. I counted that to be one of the great decisions of all time, because we would have suffered casualties in Japan, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000. the Japanese weren't going to surrender, just as they didn't do at Iwo Jima and Saipan and all those other places. So I'm just an opponent of a war because I know what it does to people. And it took me a long time to shake off the anxieties of being in combat. It is something that I pray my son never has to do. One final thing. I took him to Omaha Beach when he was 14 years old. And I took him to the American Cemetery, and I made him look at these markers on which were inscribed the bland finalities of a young man's life. More than 60% of the people buried in that American cemetery, 9,387, are between the ages of 18 and 23. And I said to my son, John, you must read this. Name, rank, outfit, and the day he died. Because these young men gave you the greatest gift one human being can proffer to another. They gave you the gift of freedom. Because you'll never have to test your own courage to see how you would react when the dagger's at the nation's belly and death stares you right in the face, and you owe it to these young men, and don't you ever forget it.
I think it would be a dereliction of my duty not to end on those words, especially since the time has come. With the great thanks of the presidential libraries to our four panelists here, we must now break for a little over an hour for lunch. We'll come back, talk about the media and public opinion with Steve Bell, Francis Fitzgerald, and Dan Rather. Please join me in thanking these gentlemen for coming.